Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. The title of today's chorale is shortened. The complete title is Christe, du Beistand deiner Kreuzgemeine, and that translates to Lord of our life and God of our salvation. I have no idea why the title of this particular chorale is shortened, but that is the complete first line of the German text. A very interesting chorale, very harmonically active, lots of direct modulations. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So we have no key signature. We start on D minor. We end on D major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale, even though we move all over the place, is D minor. It's kind of interesting that Bach opts to not use a key signature here. I think that this isn't the first time that Bach has gone to the key of D minor and has omitted the key signature, but it could be a reflection of the fact that Bach is opting out of key signatures because of the total use of accidentals throughout. So I don't know really what his relationship with the key signature was, but based on chorales like this one as well as a handful of others, it clearly was a little different than our relationship with key signatures. So we start things off with a tonic triad. We have some passing tones in the lower voices, and then we get another tonic triad in first inversion, F, A, and D. We won't rewrite the Roman numeral, we'll just do 1/6 there. Passing tone in the bass again, and then we get D, A, E, and E, which is this this D is an accented non-chord tone. It's really this C sharp here. That's our chord tone, making this an A major over C sharp, which would be a 5/6 chord. And then we get D major, I keep saying D major, D minor, or at least one of these figures where Bach implies D minor, D, A, E, and F, but switches the bass up by the time we get the resolution. So we know a tonic triad's being implied here. We have a passing tone in the bass, and then we get D minor over F, F, A, D, and F. So the inversion changes by the time we get the resolution in the alto here. And then we actually get this skip down to D here as well, which turns the chord into root position while leaving the rest of the chord intact. And our first cadence, which is a half cadence, ends on A major, A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. Our next phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence. Sorry, I wrote a lowercase a there for some reason. Doesn't really matter if it's lower or uppercase. It's just I've pretty much normalized writing all of the cadences in uppercase. It was weird how natural lowercase a. Oh, you know why lowercase a came out there? Because we're modulating to the key of A minor, and it is a direct modulation. We have a direct or juxtaposition here of A major with A minor going on the next beat, the cross relations between the C sharp and the C natural here and the bass. So we start off with a tonic triad in first inversion, A minor over C, C, A, E, and A, passing tone in the bass, and then we get A, E, E, and B. We're starting to see some similarities between the first phrase and the second phrase here. This A is an accented non-chord tone. What's being implied is E major, G sharp, E, E, and B. It happens to be in first inversion. We then get our tonic triad in root position, A, E, A, and C. So it's just a 1 chord. And this C right here very briefly turns it into first inversion before we get F, D, A, and D. It's D minor in first inversion, which is a 4/6 chord. And then we have some passing tones in the lower voices as well as the melody, which leave us with E, E, A, and C, which is a tonic triad in second inversion. And the reason why I feel like tonic triad in second inversion is significant here is because A, it's being used in a passing configuration. That's a pretty common context to see 6/4 chords, especially in Bach. But also, if we omitted this and said it's not really contributing too much to the texture, our next chord, D, F, A, and B, which is 2/6/5, is another predominant chord, so 4/6 going to 2/6/5, not really the strongest of chord progressions because the chords are very similar both in function and in pitch content, so breaking it up with a chord that splits the two predominant chords is something that Bach does from time to time. And 2/6/5, we know where that goes, 5, typically speaking, E, E, G sharp, and B. It's E major, with a passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on A minor, A, C, E, and A, which is our tonic triad in the key of A minor. We have a bit of an interesting phrase here. It's longer in proportion to the first two phrases. It's like taking the first two phrases and adding them together for the most part, but we get a mid-phrase modulation, so our final cadence in this phrase is a perfect authentic cadence, but we get to, it's a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F major, but we get there through C major. So the first point in which we're looking to modulate is somewhere near the beginning of the phrase. We start the phrase off with A minor, A, E, A, and C, which is another tonic triad, and I reckon this is the place where we modulate. I think that we start pretty early on. Of course, the difference between A minor and C major is largely debatable here because it presents a modulation zone, right, where there are multiple possibilities in which you can mark the modulation, and it largely depends on what makes sense to you as well as how you hear it. And I hear this C here as the beginning of a C major phrase. So this A minor, I think, is the gateway to C major, but this is just the beginning of the zone, so you can modulate really at any point beyond here. But this 6th chord takes us to D, F, A, and B. That is B minor 7 flat 5, which would be over D, which is a 7-6-5 chord. Kind of looks like a 2-6-5 chord in the key of A minor 2. But if we look at where it goes with these passing tones going on here, E, E, G, and B, that takes us to an E minor chord. That is our 3 chord in the key of C major, and 7 wants to go to 3 because of the cycle of falling fifths. Even though 7 more often than not goes to 1, it's going to 3 here, which is pretty cool. And 3 takes us to F, C, F, and A, which is a 4 chord, some adjacent harmony. We see 3 go to 4 with quite a bit of regularity. We also have a passing 7th in the alto here before we go to F, B, D, and G, which is a G7 chord over F in third inversion, 5-4-2. And when we see a chord in third inversion, a 7 chord in third inversion, we typically see it resolve a 5th down in terms of the Roman numeral, and the chord would be in first inversion, and that's exactly what's happening here, E, C, G, and G, which is our tonic triad C major in first inversion. The first inversion is because the bass typically resolves down by step, because the 7th of the chord is resolving down by step, and typically speaking it will resolve a 5th down. It'll follow the cycle of falling fifths. So from this point forward, we're looking for a instance in which we can make an argument to modulate to the key of F, and I think it happens closer to these B flats here, so we're going to be in C major for a little bit longer at least. We move to the next measure. We have F, C, G, and A. This G is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. That would be a 4 chord, F major, and then we get C, C, F, and G. Another suspension here. This is a 4/3 suspension though. This would be implying a tonic triad in root position, a bit of a plagal progression here. And then we get D, A, E, and F. We saw this chord earlier in D minor, which is interesting that it's being alluded to again. D minor in root position is a 2 chord in the key of C major, and I think with B flats happening on the next beat, I'm going to make an argument that we're modulating to the key of F here, and this is now our 6 chord, D minor. We then have A, C, and F, which is F major in first inversion, 6 going to 1-6, kind of an interesting progression. We see 1 go to 6 and vice versa pretty frequently in Bach, so it's not too much to write home about. It's probably the most common thirds-based progression where the roots are a third apart, and I reckon that's because the tonic is involved, but that is largely speculative though. After our 1-6 chord, we have this neighboring D here in the alto and this passing B flat in the bass, and that gives us B flat major 7 in root position, and I think that's significant to mark, and I do believe a subdivided chord progression is happening here because it takes us to a dominant chord and 4 wants to resolve to 5. It's one of its possible likely resolutions, right? C, G, C, and E. Just a regular old C major chord, which is now our dominant, not our tonic like it was before. This A is a passing tone, and this B flat that gets a beat of its own is taking the C major chord and turning it into a C7 chord, so we'll just change the figure bass to reflect that. And then we cadence on F, F, A, C, and F, ending our phrase with a perfect authentic cadence. And then we have another similarly structured phrase next in terms of the key relationships. So we have another mid-phrase modulation here, but because the phrase is shorter, it's interesting when Bach jam-packs so much harmonic content or changes into, a phrase that's just over a measure long, right? Well, actually, it's almost 2 measures long if you include the pickup and the fact that the cadence, or the last chord in the cadence, has 2 beats. But for all intents and purposes, it's a very short phrase in comparison to the previous phrase. So I do think we start in the key of D minor. We don't really have any reason to believe that we are moving to the key of C major, which is what we'll eventually cadence in. It's an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, but we go through D minor, which is interesting. So we start off with an A major chord. And I've been debating this in the past just with myself, like whether or not this is a direct modulation, because D minor or F major is diatonic to both D minor and F major, so it could be analyzed as a common chord. There's no rest or break in between the 2 phrases, and to be consistent with my past analyses, I do typically analyze these as common chord modulations, but I think there's a really strong argument to be made that this is a direct modulation, if anything, just because of the gesture, right? We have C natural versus C sharp, but it is just part of an ascending chromatic figure, and we know that with chromaticism, and especially in these contexts where they're just half-step motion in the same direction, we get interesting chord progressions. So there is a little bit of false relation going on here, cross relations, however you call it, here between the C natural and the C sharp, but that doesn't change the fact that the chords are from the same pitch collection. So whether you look at this as 3 in the key of D minor going to a 5 chord, A, C sharp, and E, or you look at this as just a direct modulation to D minor, I think they're both accurate, and there's both arguments to be made about their validity. So we have another passing tone here in the alto before we get C sharp, A, E, and E, which is just taking our 5 chord and putting it in first inversion. And here's a moment that I always like to take note of when it happens. If we see the same Roman numeral, say for example these 2 1s right here, A minor going to A minor, I won't rewrite them if they're on the same system, but in this case we have 2 of the same Roman numerals, and I am writing them repeatedly because the system breaks, and I think that when you reiterate the Roman numeral on a new system, it establishes continuity. So that's why I do that every time I do that, or at least I've been trying to bring that up every time I do that. It's just a stylistic thing I do. You can omit it if you feel like you don't need it, but for me, it would feel weird just having a blank space at the beginning of a system. That's just me though. But starting things off in the key of C major, 5 does resolve to 1, D, A, E, and F, another one of these D minor chords with the E being the 9/8 suspension. We know that our tonic's being implied, but I also think that in the key of C major this is our 2 chord, and this modulation is actually very elegant because after this passing tone in the bass and the resolution to our suspension here, we get B, G, D, and G, which is G major over B. That's 5, 6, 2 wants to go to 5. It's a pretty straightforward cadential formula. We have 2 neighbor tones here, A and C, in the bass and the alto respectively, and then we get another G major chord in first inversion, B, G, D, and G, before Bach briefly turns it back into root position, G, G, B, and G. Actually, I'm not going to mark that because the D is taken away, and of course, in major triads, when the 5th of the chord isn't present, it doesn't keep us from analyzing the chord if it's on the harmonic rhythm, but I'm typically only marking chords that are having their inversions changed if the chord is entirely intact. That's just something like a metric that I've just been tracking in my chorales as of late. I'd say like the last couple of months or so. It's definitely not something that I was doing at the beginning, but I plan to go back and take inventory of them after I finish all of the chorales. And of course our 5-6 chord does lead to our tonic triad C, G, C, and E. C major in root position. And this next phrase I think actually has the most interesting chord progression in the entire chorale, even more interesting than this one here at the beginning of the third phrase. So here we end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, and I'm fairly convinced that this entire phrase is in A minor, but when you have keys that are relative to one another, it's hard to mark individual instances where we have a direct modulation versus a common chord modulation. Here I feel like it's even more difficult than it was here between D minor and F major, because there's no cross relation. We're going between two diatonic chords with no chromaticism. So this A minor chord I think is 6-6 in the key of C major. This A minor chord actually really has a C major vibe, because the root and the bass and the tenor are singing tones that really establish this to have like a C major sound. These A's sound sort of auxiliary. But I do think this is where we modulate to the key of A minor, and lo and behold, we have a very interesting modulation here. We have I called it a modulation because we were just talking about modulations, but no, an interesting progression, D, F, A, and B, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is a 2-6-5 chord. And would you believe it, we're actually not going to E major, even though it looks like we're resolving that way, right? The lower tones in the bass are going inwards, right? We have E and E doubled in the bass, but the same way that this A minor chord here sounds like it's a C major almost, just with A's in the upper voices, this chord doesn't really sound like an E major. It sounds like it has the foundation to be E major-like, especially because of this resolution to a G sharp here with this 4-3 suspension in the alto, but it resolves to 1-6-4, which I think is really interesting, because I guess there are different ways to interpret what's happening on this beat. I think this is a 1-2-1 progression in the wild. We very seldom see 2 go to 1, and it's interesting why that doesn't really happen, because 1 and 2 would seem like a fairly straightforward progression, right? Like, the more you think about it, we see a lot of 4 going to 1. Why don't we see a lot of 2 going to 1? And we do see it from time to time, but it's far, far, far rarer. Is it rarer or more rare? I think it's rarer. Much more rarer than 4 going to 1, but for all intents and purposes, they're functionally the same chord. But I think, you know, you could make an argument that there is E major ideation going on here, E, E, and G sharp being the arguments for that, but with the C being held in the melody and it not directly resolving to B, it would go up to D and then down to B. You could potentially make the argument, but I think as far as 1-2-1 progressions are concerned, this is about as close to a straightforward 2-1 progression that you'll find in the chorales. And there aren't too many instances of that, so I'm going to tuck this chorale into my back pocket for evidence of 2 going to 1 in comparison to 4 going to 1, which we see all the time and we don't really write home about. But this is an interesting progression. Of course, it does come with its nuances, but still, 2 going to 1 fairly unabashedly. But after our 1-6-4 chord, we actually harken back to a chord progression that we saw in the second phrase, right? We had this, I guess, 2-6-5 kind of being a substitute for 4-6 here. We have 1-6-4 here, and then we have F, D, A, and D, which is a 4-6 chord, and this is going to sort of turn around and, like I said, harken back to the previous phrase here. And sorry, not the previous phrase, but a previous phrase, the second phrase more specifically. We have these 3 passing tones in the same voices, and we get E, E, A, and C, which is A minor in second inversion, 1-6-4. So we're seeing the makings of a very similar progression here, just a different take on the beginning of the phrase. We then have D, F, A, and B, which is, again, our B minor 7 flat 5 chord, but this time we're going to see it function in a much more typical situation. We have E, E, G sharp, and B. This is typically where it wants to resolve, down a fifth, and in a cadential situation, 265 typically operates as a predominant rather than like a passing plagal chord, even though there's really no reason why it shouldn't. It's just not, I guess, characteristic of Bach. But after our passing seventh, we do cadence on A minor, A, C, E, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. Then, just out of the blue, Bach modulates to G minor. It is a direct modulation to G minor. It is a distant modulation. A minor and G minor are 2 notches away from one another on the circle of fifths. Bach has been known to modulate to distant keys, not too distant, not like chromatic medians or anything like that, but fairly distant keys, at least beyond the relative keys that we have, or neighboring keys. And here's an example of that, and typically it's kind of a toss-up. We don't know whether or not Bach is going to use a common chord to go between them. There are common chords that Bach could have used to modulate between A minor and G minor. He could have used D major to modulate between the two chords. He could have used C major to modulate between the two chords, or sorry, between the two keys. But here we just have a direct modulation. We have A minor against just F sharp diminished here. So those are two very clashing chords that are not found in the same key. So this is F sharp diminished over A, C, and F sharp, which is 7-6, and that takes us directly to G minor, B flat, G, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. And then we see Bach with another chromatic bass line here. I guess it's technically 4 notes long here, and this is a relatively tame chromatic bass line, but regardless, B natural, G, D, and G would be a secondary dominant. It's a little bit more obvious in minor keys because we are changing the third here, and that creates enough contrast to tell the difference between the tonic functioning as a secondary dominant or the tonic functioning as a dominant, unlike in major keys where the third stays the same. But this would technically be 5-6 of 4 because G is now the dominant of F, at least locally for these two beats. And that's exactly, sorry, G is not the dominant of F, G is the dominant of C, and this is exactly where we go. I was saying F because I was about to mark this F as a passing tone, and it happens to be a passing seventh. And then we get C minor here, C, E flat, and G, which is our 4 chord in root position. This B flat is a chordal seventh, but it's a non-chord tone in this context because it's not part of the chord on the harmonic rhythm. That's just something that I analyze in terms of my style of analysis. You could say that that is a chord tone if you feel like it's relative, as well as all of the other chordal sevenths that occur in the chorale. They're quite common. I try to point them out whenever they occur. I'm sure some slip through the cracks, but I'm sure I think I get most of them. But regardless, our 4 chord takes us to 5, D, A, D, and F sharp. It's D major. The C, again, another seventh, before we cadence on G minor. And this is a perfect authentic cadence. Now here's an interesting situation here. Now G minor is a common chord between the next key, which is D minor. But we have this rest here, which makes the D minor phrase feel sort of isolated. So is this a common chord modulation, or is this a direct modulation? And I think the answer is yes. It could be either of them depending on how you look at it. But I feel like if I'm going to rationalize this as a common chord modulation, this might as well be a common chord modulation too, where in the key of D minor, G minor is now our 4 chord. And it makes sense because it goes to a dominant chord, right? A, C sharp, and E. A major, which is our 5 chord, and then we go to D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad. Passing seventh in the bass, B flat, G, D, and G is G minor in first inversion, that's a 4-6 chord. And then Bach takes us to root position on the end of the beat, G, B flat, D, and G, which is our 5-3 chord, or just saying that it's in root position and the chord's entirely intact. And then we get A, D, and E. Another suspension where we see the suspended tone occur in the alto. It's pretty much exclusively suspensions in the alto in this chorale, which is pretty interesting. But this would be implying a 5 chord, A major. It's just this D as a 4-3 suspension over the bass. One of the more common suspensions we see in cadences in Bach. before we get the resolution on the next beat, A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5-chord still. We have a passing 7th here in the tenor, and then we cadence not on D minor, but D major, as Bach often does with his minor chorales. And that is today's analysis. Very harmonically active, lots of direct modulations, interesting chord progressions, a 1-2-1 progression. Never thought I would see it. Actually, I'm sure that, this isn't the only time the progression has happened. We've seen it a couple of times even in cadential situations. In fact, 2-1 progressions are more common, in my opinion, in cadential situations than they are in the middle of the phrase. And I think that that's making a statement, because I can't think of another time I've seen 2 go to 1 in such a plain manner where there isn't something else going on to muddy the texture. I suppose you could make an argument here that this takes us to an augmented triad, but it really doesn't sound like an augmented triad because this G sharp really does feel more ornamental than anything else. But all in all, from a harmonic standpoint, really not too difficult to analyze. Harmony, for the most part, was straightforward and functional, at least traditionally functional. And I think I'm going to wrap the analysis up on that. Actually, there are a couple of other things I want to mention, or just takeaways. One is the fact that there's some key signature disagreement, right? D minor typically is associated with 1 flat being in the key signature. Here we have no key signature, but I reckon that's because we spend a lot of time in C major and A minor as well. But we also spend a lot of time in D minor and G minor as well as F major. So I don't know really why Bach chose to do that. Maybe he went through the chorale and made the choice himself. After all, there's probably like a reason behind it, because this isn't the case with every chorale. Mid-phrase modulations are also really interesting when they happen. 1 in C major, 1 in D minor. I already talked about the 1-2-1 progression. Distant modulations, right? The fact that we went from A minor to G minor directly is pretty interesting as well. Typically Bach goes to keys that are adjacent to one another, right? D and A and C, C and F. F and D, right? G and D, they're all more or less related by being either adjacent to one another on the circle of fifths or relative to one another. But other than that, like I said, fairly straightforward chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon as well if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload, and hit the like button if you'd like my videos to be seen by more people. It's a tremendous help to me as a content creator. But other than that, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.